So how well does the Nikon Z8 autofocus perform with birds in flight? Well, we're going to review footage of an eagle, barn owl, great horned owl, and a Harris's hawk that I captured at the Canada Raptor Conservancy with images to follow. Plus, I have a clarification about the previous autofocus review I did for the Nikon Z8. So let's get that out of the way first. Now, in that tutorial, I lumped the wide area and custom focus modes into one category and didn't clarify that the C1 and C2 are customizable. This means you can customize those focus areas to any size you need. Now the question is, how do you resize C1 and C2? Well, stay till the very end and I'll share how you can customize your C1 and C2 autofocus areas for your Nikon Z8. All right, so we're gonna start off with some video footage of this great horned owl, and I'm using the auto area focus mode with animal subject detection, and the owl is going to fly from this perch to another perch over here on the right side. And you're going to notice that the focus mode is going to begin hunting or searching for the subject, and it's gonna have a hard time locating it and focusing on it. So let's go ahead and start the video here. And you can see that the hunting is going on. And once the owl leaves this perch, it recognizes this tree stump as a possible animal for some reason. But as the owl flies through the scene, that tree stump leaves the frame, and then the autofocus system has to find another subject within it, and it has a hard time locating the owl. So you can see here, it's focusing more on the background because it's still not quite sure where the animal is. And again, down here, it's focusing below the owl again. And it's not until the owl begins filling up the frame because it's getting closer to me that it then says, oh, wait a minute, there's the subject right there. And then it begins focusing from this point. And then once it lands, it's focusing all the way to this point right here. So out of this sequence of images, I took 40 images in total and only 7 were in focus. All right, so let's take a quick look at the 40 images that I captured, and I'm gonna give you some additional tips on what's going on with the autofocus system and how to improve your chances of tracking and focusing on your subject. So I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in. This is the first image of the great horned owl, and as you can see, it's out of focus. And so are every other image that follows until, like I mentioned, the owl begins to fill up the frame, and then the autofocus system begins to recognize the subject and begins its focusing right here. So this image is in focus as well as the last 6. So there's a few things going on that I think help the autofocus system find, track, and focus on a subject. So at this point, it's starting to recognize that there's a shift in color, contrast, and texture in this part of the frame, and it recognizes this as a subject because of that. Also, because we have some separation between the background and the subject now, it's better able to recognize this as the subject. So if we take a look at the first image here, you can see that we don't have any bokeh going on, or the depth of field is not as shallow as it is once it begins focusing right here. So if we take a look at these two images side by side, the reason why this has a shallow depth of field and this one doesn't, even though I'm using 5.6 for both, is the background is too close to the subject. So the background is within that plane of the depth of field. So it's going to be somewhat in focus if it's within that range. Here, because the background is further from the subject, we're able to get that separation and begin creating that blurry background or that bokeh. And the other thing that's affecting the depth of field is the fact that I'm closer to the subject, which creates more of a compression and blurs out that background even more. And I believe that helps the autofocus system, regardless of which one you use, better recognize the subject so it can track and focus on it. And we can definitely see that in this photo here. Now, same great horned owl, just a different position within the park, two different perches, and the background this time is even further away from the subject versus the other set of images that I showed you. And because of that shallow depth of field, there's a greater separation between the background and the subject, and the auto area focus mode was able to find, track, and focus on the great horned owl. And in this sequence of images, I took 20 images and only 2 were out of focus. Now, in the wild, we're not going to have the luxury of positioning our subjects and ourselves in a way to create that separation between the background and the foreground, or the subject in this case. So what we can do instead is choose the right autofocus mode for the situation. So if you're in a situation where that background and your subject are pretty close, you may want to use a wide area focus mode instead, to allow that focus mode to concentrate in that little area versus the entire frame. All right, next we have the Harris's hawk, and this is the same location and setup as that great horned owl image that I showed you. And because we have enough distance between the subject and the background, I'm able to create that shallow depth of field, which makes it easier for the auto area focus mode to find, track, and focus on our subject until it gets lower to the ground. So it's in focus here, and then once it gets into this area, it begins losing the subject in all of this tall grass here. So all of these elements here are now becoming a distraction because they are within the same plane or depth of field as the hawk, and it's not quite sure where that hawk is until, like before, once it gets closer to me, it then begins locating, tracking, and focusing on the hawk. Now, for this set of images, I took a total of 21 images and 14 were out of focus. So not a very good success ratio. However, the next set of images here, let's see, I took 19 images and 2 were out of focus. But just like before, let's go ahead and reset this. It had a pretty good success rate at the beginning, but once it got lower to the ground, it lost track of the hawk and wasn't able to focus on it until, again, it got closer to me, and then we have enough separation between the background and our subject. Now, if we compare this to that great horned owl image, let's take a look at that. You're gonna notice that without the crop that I applied, that the owl is flying higher than the hawk. So there really isn't any additional elements coming into the frame to distract the focus system, and the distance between the background and the subject stays pretty much the same. Whereas with the hawk, because it's flying lower to the ground, we're introducing additional elements to compete with the subject, and the focus system gets confused and loses the subject in the process. All right, next we have a barn owl, and you can see that the auto area focus mode is locked onto the owl, and once he takes off, it begins tracking and focusing on the owl all the way through. We have a very short distance for this particular setup, but I was able to capture 4 images and only 1 was out of focus. Now for the next sequence, it was a little bit longer of a flight. So let's take a look. We have auto area focus mode again. We have enough color and contrast and texture difference between the owl and the rest of the frame that it's able to lock onto the owl and follow it through the entire scene. But it does lose it at one point. I believe it's right in here because of this change in background, possibly. Not sure if that was it or not, but I was able to capture quite a few more images, and most of them were in focus. So let's take a look at those real quick. So those are the first 4 images, and I took 22 or 21 images here, and I believe only 2 were out of focus in this sequence. So there's the first image, and you can see that the tracking system is doing a pretty good job on tracking and focusing, but I believe this image here was a little soft. It's not bad, but it's a little soft. So was this image here, and then it locks back on and now it's tack sharp again. And here is my final image that I liked, that I cropped and edited in Lightroom and Topaz Photo AI to sharpen up that image and to remove some of that digital noise. I prefer Topaz Photo AI versus denoise in Lightroom. That's just my personal preference. All right, now let's check out the bald eagle. Again, auto area focus mode. It's locked onto the head of the bald eagle, but once it begins taking off, it loses the head of the eagle and the body of the eagle, and it's not able to track and focus on it until it finds the head of the eagle again. I believe it's right there. It recognizes it, and then it begins focusing right here, and it's better able to track from this point all the way through the end. Even though there's some grass you're gonna see here in the front, it's blurred out enough, I think, that it's not a distraction to the autofocus system. Plus, he's flying so fast that I don't think the autofocus system had enough time to be distracted from that grass or even this grass right here. It's able to focus on all the way through to the end here, which is pretty awesome. And check out this image that I captured from this sequence. This is one of my favorites from this series of images with the bald eagle. And out of 24 images, I had a total of 12 images in focus. Now for this last set of images, I switched to wide large because I wanted to give the Z8 a smaller area to locate, track, and target my subject as he flew across the pond. And although my success rate in terms of number of images in focus versus out of focus was much higher versus auto area focus mode, this area mode was too small for this subject. I had a very hard time keeping the subject within this area, and eventually I lost him. So I would have been better off using one of the custom area modes and increasing the size of the area to keep that subject within it. Now the question is, how do you resize those custom area modes to get a larger area? Well, check out this video tutorial next to find out how.